In the last lecture, we created our first basic directive, and it's doing its job. We learned how to create a selector, how to use that selector, like an attribute in this case, since we set up an attribute selector, and how to register it in app module. We also learned how to get access to the element the directive sits on. This, however, is not the best way of changing that style, because as you might recall from some earlier lecture in this course, accessing elements directly like this is not a good practice. You should use a different tool, which I'll show you in a second, because Angular actually is also able to render your templates without a DOM. And then these properties might not be available. It could do this when using service workers, so basically some advanced use cases, but nonetheless, it's not a good practice to directly access your elements. How should you access them then? Well, there is some other helper you can inject. It's the renderer. So let's do this, but actually let's not do it in our basic highlight directive. Let's create a new one, and for this I will create a new one with the generate command, or just G as you learned with the CLI, and then directive, or just D, and then any name of your choice, and I'll name this better highlight. So this will give us a new file or two new files. I can delete the testing file, and we can also put this into its own folder, of course. It's not the default, but let's do it here. Better highlight. You could also create a central shared or directives folder where you store all your directives. For now, just for demo purposes and to have a clear separation and make this easy to see, I'll put them into individual folders. So better highlight directive here. In the app module, I will need to adjust my path since I just moved it to the better highlight folder. So make sure to point to the right path in the right file then. In there, we got a selector, app better highlight. Now let's inject this better tool I was referring to. It's the renderer, which is of type renderer2. And this needs to be imported from @angular/core. Now with this injected we can use it, and I will use ng on init again to still stick to this best practice of doing initialization work there. Make sure to import ng on init, or just on init here, from @angular_core. And now let's implement ng on init here. And there I can now use the renderer. I do this by calling the property, which I created here, the private renderer. And there we get a couple of helper methods you can use to work with the DOM basically. Now, one important method I'm interested in here is the setStyle method. This method allows us to, guess what, set the style of some element. Now, the problem here is, for that, we need to have the element for which we want to set the style. And of course, in Angular, there are different ways of getting such an element. Here in the directive, it's exceptionally simple. We already saw how to get one in the basic directive, the basic highlight directive. We can simply inject the element reference. So I'll add another private property here, or argument, which will automatically be bound to a private property, I should say, which I'll name lref. And this will be of type element ref, which we then also, as before, need to import here, element ref, from @angular_core. Now with this import added here, now I can use this element ref here by calling this lref. And here I then want to access the native element. And that's important. We can't pass the reference itself. We need to get access to the underlying element and pass this as a first argument here to setStyle. Now setStyle takes a couple of other arguments. We defined which element we want to style. Now we have to define which style we want to set. And that would be the background color in our case. With the style property defined, the third argument we pass to the setStyle method is the value we want to assign for this property. Now we could set the background color here to blue. The fourth and final argument is a flags object. Here we can set a couple of flags for this style. And this is optional. I will leave it out here. What you could set here are things like if you want to add an important tag, so this exclamation mark important annotation for a style to override other styles or something like that. Now this however does it for my cases here, and now if we save this with our better to highlight directive already added to app module, we can go to the app component and add it here too. I will simply duplicate this paragraph here and use app better highlight here, our new directive, again, which is available through the selector since we also added it to the app module. And then here I want to style this with a better directive. Now, if we save this and let it recompile and reload the browser, we already see the blue background here behind this paragraph. So our new directive here, the better directive, is working, and now we're using the renderer, which is a better approach of accessing the DOM. Now, why is it a better approach? Angular is not limited to running in the browser here. It, for example, also works with service workers. And these are environments where you might not have access to the DOM. So if you try to change the DOM as you did here in basic highlight, by directly accessing the native element and the style of this element, you might get an error in some circumstances. Now, to be honest, in most circumstances you probably don't, and you probably also know if your app is going to run in the browser or not. Still, it is a better practice to use the renderer for DOM access and to use the methods the renderer provides to access the DOM. You can learn more about the renderer in an article after this lecture here if you're interested. Just another note, I had to re-record this part here because the renderer type here changed from renderer v2 to just renderer 2, as did some arguments you could pass to set style. Therefore, in the other videos in this section, you will see that this code looks slightly different, not by much though. Don't get confused by this. The code you see here is the code you should use and the code which will work. All the other code shown in the section, of course, is not changed, is still the same. It's only this renderer set style method and the renderer type, which is now renderer 2 and not renderer v2, as you will see in the other videos. With that, let's move on. So we saw two examples for directives now, and the better approach definitely is a good approach. But it's not very interactive, right? It always gives us a blue background, and I want to change this. I only want to style this blue or give this a blue background if I hover over it. And if I move my mouse away, it should go back to transparent. So let's improve the better highlight here a bit. We need to react to some events occurring on the element the directive sits on. And a quick and easy way to do this inside of this directive is to simply add a new decorator, and this is the host listener decorator, which needs to be imported from @Angular core, and add it to some method we want to execute. So the method here could be mouse over. Now I will move this from the top of the file below ng on init here. So now this can be triggered whenever some event occurs, and that event is specified here as an argument as a string. Host listener here takes the argument name as an input, and that would be mouse enter, let's say. That is one of the events supported by the DOM element this directive sits on. So you have basically all events available you could also use with event binding before. So that's my host listener targeting this event. And we could also receive the event data here. So event data of type event would be passed to us here. So that works. You can also listen to custom events here and retrieve that data. So this is just like the method you execute when you add a click listener or whatever your event is, and then pass the method between the quotation marks. So that's happening here. Host listener is just a convenient way of listening to events on that element. So with that, we listen to the mouse enter event, we get the event data, which I don't need here. But what I want to do in this case is I want to change the background color of the element. So what I can do is I can copy this code from ng on init and comment it out, and now set the style here on mouse enter. And now I can quickly copy this and add another method, which I'll name mouse leave maybe, where I will listen to the mouse leave event, another official event I can listen to. And then I want to set the background color to transparent maybe. Now with this in place, we should have a reactive directive. So now, no background color, and if I hover over it, it gets blue. So that is working as intended. Now with host listener, reacting to user event or to any events. So we learned about host listener, and this setup here is absolutely fine for what we're doing. But we got another decorator we can use, which then allows us to not use the renderer. There is nothing wrong with using the renderer, but we got an even easier way of simply changing the background color if that is all we want to do in the directive. Again, using the renderer is not wrong though. The decorator I'm referring to is called @HostBinding, which also needs to be imported from @AngularCore. And since we got a lot of imports, I'll quickly restructure this to cover multiple lines. So HostBinding, that's the new decorator. And I will come back to what we pass here in a second. First of all, we need to bind this to some property which value will become important. So that could be a background color property, a new property I create here, which is of type string. Now in HostBinding, we can pass a string defining to which property of the hosting element we want to bind. Now, properties of the hosting element, that is simply what we also access here in the basic highlight directive. Style would be such a property, and there then the background color property to be precise. Therefore, we can simply say style dot and now camel case background color, and that's all. Camel case is important here because we're accessing the DOM property, which doesn't know dashes. So with this, what we're telling Angular is, on the element this directive sits, please access the style property, which pretty much any input has. On other directives, which access something like the value, you of course have to make sure that they are only added to inputs which have this property. But here again, the style property should be available on any element. So here we access the style property, and then there a sub property, the background color, and we set this equal to whatever background color is set to here. Well, and we can simply change background color here when we mouse over it. We can set background color to blue in this case, and set it to transparent in this case here, transparent. And I will comment out the renderer code here. Again, not wrong to use it, but no longer needed in this example. Of course, we also have to set some initial color so that we don't get an error before we mouse over it the first time. So here I will set this to transparent initially, give this initial value. With this, it's transparent, no error, looks good. And if we hover over it, it works the same way as before, but now solely driven through host listener and HostBinding, a great way for working with the element inside of a directive. And of course here on HostBinding, you can bind to any property of the element you're sitting on.